In April of 1963, a campaign began in Birmingham, Alabama, to bring attention to the deep and bitter segregation in that city. The preceding 2 decades saw 50 bombings of African-American homes, businesses, and churches. Yeah, how many of you here were born after 1963? For me, growing up after that, it's almost inconceivable to think of that pace of bombings and burnings. It's so far outside of my experience of what's even possible. 50 bombings in 2 decades. In 1960, the city of Birmingham had 350,000 people and 0 black firefighters or bus drivers or cashiers in the stores. The Southern Christian Leadership Conference organized a nonviolent campaign that would draw the eyes of the world. Thank you, Tom. And the eye of national politics to Birmingham. They organized sit-ins that prompted mass arrests. The city got an injunction to ban all public protest, so the SCLC and Dr. King and other organizers trained students. They trained college students and high school students and even elementary school students to walk nonviolently in groups of 50 at a time from 16th Street Baptist Church to City Hall. They were arrested and the jails were filled, but not before the police department used water hoses and attack dogs on students, children, bystanders. When Martin Luther King was arrested, the organizers did not bail him out of jail. He wanted to stay in, strategizing correctly that staying there would shine a brighter light of media attention and political attention on the city. And while in jail, he read from a newspaper a letter from 8 local clergymen. They deplored what they called his outside agitation. And they urged negotiation and legal process rather than protest. Demonstration, they said, was untimely and unwise. Pursue change in the courts. Follow all the laws until then. Why protest? Why go out into the streets? Why disrupt the ordinary function of law and order? Why invite the police response? Why invite the arrests? Why inconvenience the citizens of Birmingham? Why upset the routines of work and shopping? Why bring children out of school to be arrested? Why take up the time of emergency workers? Demonstration, they said, was untimely and unwise. Pursue change in the courts. Follow all the laws until then. I dwell on this because if you're comfortable, it's not obvious those white clergymen were wrong. It's obvious in history. It's obvious looking back at Birmingham in 1963. It's less obvious today. I've heard those questions asked. If you don't experience what people of color experience, if you don't see it, if you don't know it is happening right here and now, that it is not history, then these questions are sharp. They're real. This letter from a Birmingham jail was Dr. King's response, and I want to spend some time with it, some time with his words, some time to hear directly from the man we so often honor at a distance. As one poet says, now that he is safely dead, let us praise him. To hear from a man we make tame and historic rather than radical and present. Here's what he says. My dear fellow clergymen, I think I should indicate why I am here in Birmingham, since you have been influenced by the view which argues against outsiders coming in. I'm in Birmingham because injustice is here. I am cognizant of the interrelatedness of all communities and states. I can't sit idly by in Atlanta and not be concerned about what's happening in Birmingham. Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. We are caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied in a single garment of destiny. And whatever affects one directly affects all of us indirectly. And never again can we afford to live with the provincial outside agitator idea. Anyone who lives inside the United States can never be considered an outsider anywhere in its bounds. You deplore the demonstrations taking place in Birmingham, but your statement, I am sorry to say, fails to express a similar concern for the conditions that brought about the demonstrations. I'm sure that none of you would want to rest content with the superficial kind of social analysis that merely deals with effects and does not grapple with the underlying causes. It is unfortunate that demonstrations are taking place in Birmingham. But it is even more unfortunate that the city's white power structure left the community with no alternative. You may well ask, why direct action? Why sit-ins, marches, and so forth? Isn't negotiation a better path? Well, you're quite right in calling for negotiation. Indeed, this is the very purpose of direct action. Nonviolent direct action seeks to create such a crisis and foster such a tension that a community which has constantly refused to negotiate is forced to confront these issues. It seeks to so dramatize the issue it can no longer be ignored. My citing of the creation of tension as part of the work of the nonviolent resistor may sound shocking, but I must confess that I am not afraid of the word tension. I have earnestly opposed violent tension, but there is a type of constructive, nonviolent tension which is necessary for growth. We know through painful experience that freedom is never voluntarily given by the oppressor. It must be demanded by the oppressed. I have yet to engage in a direct action campaign that was well-timed. Right? That was well-timed in the view of those who have not suffered unduly from the disease of segregation. And for years now, I have heard the word wait. It rings in my ear with a piercing familiarity. The wait has almost always meant never. We must come to see with one of our distinguished jurists that justice too long delayed is justice denied. We have waited more than 340 years for our constitutional, our God-given rights, and perhaps it is easy for those who have never felt the stinging darts of segregation to say wait. But when you have seen vicious mobs lynch your mothers and fathers at will and drown your sisters and brothers on a whim, when you have seen hate-filled policemen curse, kick, and even kill your black brothers and sisters, when you have seen the vast majority of your 20 million brothers smothering in an airtight cage of poverty in the midst of an affluent society, when you have to concoct an answer for a 5-year-old son who is asking, "Daddy, why do white people treat colored people so mean?" When you are harried day and haunted by night by the fact that you are living constantly at a tiptoe stance, never quite knowing what to expect next, when you're plagued with inner fears and outer resentments, when you are forever fighting a degenerating sense of nobodiness, then you understand why we find it difficult to wait. There comes a time when the cup of endurance runs over, and men are no longer willing to be plunged into the abyss of despair. I dwell on this. I appreciate this. I read these words at length because these are not words about history, but about the present too. It's a call and a reminder, unpleasant though it may be for so many of us to face it, a reminder that we often speak as the heroes of our own stories and rarely know ourselves to be the bystanders in someone else's story. We ask reasonable sounding questions, and they really do sound reasonable until we understand how deeply unreasonable they are in someone else's life. Dr. King continues. He says, I had hoped that the white moderate would understand that law and order exist for the purpose of establishing justice, and that when they fail in this purpose, they become the dangerously structured dams that block the flow of social progress. I had hoped that the white moderate would understand that the present tension is a necessary phase of transition from an obnoxious negative peace to a substantive and positive peace in which all men will respect the dignity and worth of human personality. And actually, we who engage in nonviolent direct action are not the creators of tension. We're merely bringing to the surface the hidden tension that is already alive. We bring it out in the open where it can be seen and dealt with like a boil that can never be cured so long as it's covered up, but must be opened with all its ugliness to the natural medicines of air and light. Injustice must be exposed with all the tensions its exposure creates to the light of human conscience and to the air of national opinion before it can be cured. Last Sunday, asking what it means to hope, I shared words from the author Rebecca Solnit, who says that hope is an embrace of the unknown and the unknowable. Hope is the belief that what we do matters, even though how and when it may matter, who and what it may impact, are not things we can know ahead of time. The very first words of nonviolent resistance in this country were from Aidan Ballou. He was a Universalist minister and later a Unitarian minister in the mid-19th century. Ballou founded a utopian community called Hopedale. It was a village of 200 where everyone was bound together by a covenant, by the promises, the commitments they made to each other, a covenant which read in part, he does not go halfway with this, I hold myself bound never under any pretext whatsoever to kill, assault, beat, torture, enslave, rob, oppress, persecute, defraud, corrupt, slander, revile, injure, envy, or hate any human being, even my worst enemy. For Ballou, our obligation was not to the state, which enforced its laws with violence, but to a higher moral law. And that covenant kept on going. It continued. I hold myself bound never to indulge in self-will, bigotry, love of preeminence, covetousness, deceit, profanity, idleness, or an unruly tongue, never to justify myself in a known wrong. It is maybe not a surprise that as a community, Hopedale was a total failure. They could not get the economics to work. They couldn't get the relationships to work. That higher moral law was exacting and aspirational and unapologetically radical. I hope there was room in that for lots of grace. So there we are. We leave Aidan Ballou, the nonviolent dreamer, having failed to establish utopia on earth. And after all, the 19th century is actually full of experiments like this. There are dozens of these utopian communities where people separate themselves from society and try to figure it all out. And that could be the end of the story. But for Leo Tolstoy, having found fame and success, the great Russian writer, and a vocation as a reformer as well as writer, he enters his 50s and begins this deep crisis of conscience and purpose. And he reads Aidan Ballew's book, and he starts corresponding with Ballew. He discovers this core message, Tolstoy does, of what Ballew calls the law of love, which requires a renunciation of all forms of violence. And Tolstoy writes about this eloquently in the closing decades of the 19th century, and that could be the end of the story. But one of Tolstoy's readers, living alone at the time in Pretoria, South Africa, was a young lawyer, 24 years old, Mohandas Gandhi. And for Gandhi, Tolstoy's idea of nonviolence became central to his life and teaching, to his whole way of being in the world. Nonviolence, not just as what you act on, but the way you conduct yourself inside. And that could be the end of the story, but Martin Luther King read the words of Gandhi and became convinced that nonviolent direct action was the only viable strategy to make change in this country. But more than that, nonviolence was the only way to make change and to live in this country that day by day would grind you into dust, the only way to do it without losing your soul and yourself along the way. So there are two stories you can tell about Aidan Ballew. One of them is a failed utopian dreamer whose business partners abandon him. And the other is the story of a man whose idea, once set free in the world, grows and thrives and animates movements for justice from Birmingham to Boulder. And that I hold tight to, hope as the embrace of the unknown and unknowable. Hope that change will come, that defeat is temporary, though justice is not inevitable. That what we do matters, even if we don't get to know how or where beforehand. And hand in hand, I put that with Dr. King's counsel, who says, softly or loudly, gently or sharply, who says to each one of us, not 60 years ago, but in this room today, that we must begin by paying attention, by asking ourselves, what in my comfort do I not see? And then going to work. Amen.